In 1891, James Naismith nailed a peach basket to a wall in Massachusetts and created one of the greatest games in history, basketball, with no idea what this new sport would eventually become. Basketball grew, and in 1949, the two existing basketball leagues of the time merged into one, creating the NBA. Over the last 70 years, basketball has had some truly great eras and players. The 60s, with the superhuman Wilt Chamberlain and the ultimate winner Bill Russell. The 80s, with the rivalry of Magic and Bird. The 90s, when Michael Jordan became, and still is for many, including myself, the greatest player in NBA history. The 2000s, when greats like Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, and Shaquille O'Neal won most of their titles and became legendary. And most recently, the 2010s, when three-pointers began to completely change the way the game is played, and LeBron James became a worthy rival to Michael Jordan for the title of the GOAT. Now we're entering the 2020s, after possibly the strangest year the NBA has ever seen, and I want to look back at these decades and determine which one was really the best, which era of basketball was truly the greatest in NBA history. The 1990s. This is it. This is where we're getting into the real good shit, okay? The 70s and the 80s, the 60s and the 80s, they were the warm-up, alright? They were the appetizer. This is where basketball really hit its fucking peak, and it has not gone down since, okay? Its popularity reached a peak, the talent level reached a peak. Well, not quite. We'll get into this, alright? We'll get into it. 1990s are obviously known for one player, specifically, and that's Michael fucking Jordan, the greatest player of all time, alright? You're taking a guy with Wilt Chamberlain's talent and highlight reel, and you're combining him with the winning of Bill Russell, and you have the greatest player of all time, in my opinion. And I feel like most people should still share that opinion. If you don't, that's okay though. LeBron's pretty fucking good too. And that's not what this video is about. Alright, not what this video is about. This video is about how Michael Jordan helped make the 90s so fucking good. And it wasn't just him. The 90s at the time was the peak of superstar talent in the league. Okay, you can argue that it's become more talented since then. I would say, and I'm quoting Rusty Buckets here, the ceiling of talent in the league hasn't necessarily improved since the 90s, but the floor has. So I'd say the worst players are better than they were in the 90s, however the best players are about the same. But if you look at superstar talent, there's a strong argument to be made that it was the most talented that the league ever was, okay? You've got Charles Barkley, Michael Jordan, obviously, first. Okay, Michael fucking Jordan. At the very beginning of the 90s, you got Magic Johnson, who still won a freaking MVP in 1990. See, I mentioned Michael Jordan, right? Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, although Dennis Rodman was not a superstar, and people who think he was are clowns. David Robinson, Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, Karl Malone, John Stockton. All right, towards the end of the decade, Shaq during the 90s, Penny Hardaway for the little bit that he was healthy. Shawn Kemp and Gary Payton. All right, Clyde Drexler. Absolutely stacked era. Towards the end of the decade, you get new guys coming in like Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett and Kobe Bryant, Dirk Nowitzki, all right, Allen Iverson. Absolutely fantastic decade talent-wise, all right? And you look at the teams, the 90s is where the West finally flipped the script, all right? Prior to the 90s, one of my big criticisms with the 80s West, or with the 80s decade, I should say, is that the West was pretty fucking weak, which led to the Lakers making the finals every single season. And the 90s changed that. The 90s was where the West finally became strong. At the start, you still had the Lakers with Magic Johnson and James Worthy after Kareem retired, alright? And it ended the decade with the Shaq and Kobe Lakers, who were very good for a few years before they finally won the title, because you don't have Shaq on your team, and your team not be good. You also had the Seattle Supersonics, who peaked in 96, but for several years were a legit contender team. This was a fantastic team. You had Clyde Drexler's Blazers, Very good. The Charles Barkley Suns, which in my opinion were the best team of the 90s outside of the Bulls or the Rockets. And I'd say as a team, they were actually better than the Rockets. Hakeem Olajuwon was just a fucking god. All right, Kevin Johnson, who was the second star on the Suns at the time behind Barkley, one of the most underrated players in NBA history. Okay, I don't know if I would quite say the dude was a superstar, but definitely like a high tier all-star. Okay, this man was fantastic. Very good player. All right, people really underrate that Suns team. It's not like Charles Barkley was carrying some scrubs. Okay, he was on a very good team with multiple very good players. Of course, everyone knows the Utah Jazz with Malone and Stockton. Stockton may be one of the most overrated players in NBA history, but there's no denying the dude could fucking pass the ball. Also, very, very healthy duo, which is a huge reason they both have such massive career totals. They were very healthy players for their careers. All right, they had some great seasons, especially at the end of the 90s. Karl Malone was a two-time MVP. Stockton, I wouldn't even say he was a superstar, but he was definitely an all-star level player every year, nevertheless. Fantastic teams. And of course, the Houston Rockets with Hakeem Olajuwon, who couldn't get it done for several years, and then they fucking repeat. All right, 2 wins in a row on the back of Hakeem. Oh, Hakeem's fucking ridiculous, because this dude had kind of a Dirk thing, where he just went off and carried his team one season, except he did it twice, and he did it in a way that was more impressive than Dirk, in my opinion, because he beat better teams. All right, David Robinson Spurs is another team I forgot to mention. They never made the finals, but they were really fucking good nonetheless. David Robinson was an amazing player, getting kind of underrated, honestly. So many good fucking teams in the 90s. In the East, it wasn't as strong. You had the Jordan Bulls being amazing the whole time. The Pistons were strong at the beginning of the 90s. The Shaq Magic got strong towards the end of the 90s. The Pacers were pretty good in the late 90s. Trying to think of other teams. The East was definitely not as strong, but it wasn't as weak as the 90s West, that's for sure. I would say the East in the 90s is very close to where it is today, where it was very top heavy with a few good teams, and then it was relatively weak. Now, Michael Jordan is obviously the main attraction of the 1990s, okay? Like I said, the dude was just insanely popular. He won so much. He had the storyline, because prior to the 90s, Let's go through Michael Jordan's storyline real quick. Prior to the 1991 season where he finally won a title, everyone said he couldn't do it. They said he wasn't good enough. He couldn't beat the Celtics. He couldn't beat the Pistons. He can't win a championship. He's just not good enough. Then he beats the Lakers, and everyone writes it off. They say, well, they got injured. Maybe things would have gone differently. They were old. Blah, 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 blah. Then next year, he beats the Blazers. Well, Clyde Drexler really wasn't that good. The team wasn't really that good. Blah, 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 blah. Then he beats the fucking Suns. 3-peats for the first time since Bill Russell, I believe. Okay, finally shut the haters up, but then he retires. So then this man's got 3 titles, and he just fucking retires and goes plays baseball. The league loses its best player for a year and a half. He comes back, loses to the Magic. All right. Michael Jordan, he's washed. He played baseball. He can't do it anymore. He passed his prime, blah, 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 blah. Then he has the greatest regular season of all time. Win-wise, it was the greatest of all time until 2016, when the Warriors won one more game with 73 wins instead of 72. But nevertheless, at the time, greatest regular season win record of all time. 72 wins, ridiculous, wins the title. And then he does it again. And then he does it again. And the 98 season was by far the most impressive, because people can sit there all they want and act like Jordan was carried and had this amazing team. And some years he did have an amazing team, don't get me wrong. Okay, 96, let's not pretend like that team wasn't stacked. Okay, that 96 team was amazing. However, in 98, Pippen was no longer an all-star. He was no longer an all-star caliber player. Also, he was dealing with injuries all season. Jordan had some injuries during the season. Dennis Rodman, I don't know if he just partied too much, or he didn't give a shit anymore because, they'd won 2 titles, or maybe he just got old. But Dennis Rodman kind of sucked ass in 98. Like, not really, but compared to his old self, he sucked ass. Alright, the man was fucking benched during the Eastern Conference Finals because he was so bad. Okay? He was not the same Dennis Rodman as he was in 96. Pippen was no longer an all-star player, like I said. Jordan was like 35 years old. And yet he carried them to the fucking title. A title they weren't supposed to win. They were not supposed to beat the Jazz that year. That Jazz team was fucking amazing. Karl Malone and John Stockton. They were an amazing team. And Michael Jordan beat him. Michael Jordan said, fuck no, I'm ending on another win. Then he retired again. Hakeem Olajuwon, his 2 titles, all-time great titles, both of them. 94 has an argument for being the greatest season of all time, where Hakeem won the MVP and Defensive Player of the Year in the same year and won the title without a single All-Star teammate. And then the next year, the only All-Star teammate he had was Clyde Drexler, who was no longer in his prime, and he won it as a 6th seed. Talk about a fucking storyline. Hakeem Olajuwon is a fucking beast, man. He has an argument for being the best center of all time. The center's position is definitely the hardest position to argue which player is the greatest all time, in my opinion, because you've got 5 guys who you can at least somewhat make an argument for in Shaq, Hakeem, Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, and Kareem. And it's insane that Hakeem Olajuwon even is being mentioned with those guys, but he was ridiculous, okay? Arguably the greatest defensive player of all time. Arguably the greatest center of all time. Ridiculous carry job he did those years. Charles Barkley was another great player in the 90s, okay? There were just so many great players. It was a fantastic era, and that's why NBA basketball reached its peak then in popularity. All right, Magic and Bird, they started it. They started it all in the 80s with them. And then Michael Jordan took what they had, and he just turned it up to 11. Okay, the NBA was ridiculously popular at the time, and it was all thanks to the most popular player who has ever played, Michael Jordan. Now, with everything I've said, because I've done a lot of praising for the 90s, and in my opinion, it's definitely the best era so far, okay? Between talent, competition, popularity, it's the best era so far. Definitely better than any era that came before. But it still wasn't quite perfect. Alright, the 90s was still not a perfect era. Despite the competition improving vastly in the West, the league introduced several new teams, expansion teams, and these teams sucked ass at the start, okay? Look at the Minnesota Timberwolves. They've been a really good team like twice in their entire franchise, and one of those times was with Jimmy Butler a few years ago, and one of those times was with KG in 2004. Okay, they've spent the rest of their existence sucking ass. They've been incompetent since the beginning, and they sucked ass in the early 90s, okay? Even when they first got KG, they sucked. And there are several other teams just like them, like the Grizzlies too, who just sucked fucking butt during the 90s, okay? That made it a little bit easier for the best teams to have higher wins, and the worst teams to be even worse because they sucked extra ass, alright? Obviously, expansion teams are necessary, but at the time, adding them, it did dilute the talent in the league just a little, just slightly. And that's part of the reason why the East was very weak in the 90s, compared to the West, at least. Alright, it's better than it was during, say, the 2000s, but nevertheless, it wasn't the greatest. But the biggest issue for me with the 90s, it really comes with the fact that Michael Jordan was not there for the entire decade. If Michael Jordan went and he retired in like 99 or 2000, maybe we'd be looking at a different story. However, to start the 90s, the dude retired in 93. He was gone for a year and a half. So that's a year and a half without the best player in basketball. And when he came back, he was clearly rusty. He wasn't in full shape anymore. So realistically, 2 years without real Michael Jordan. Then he retires again in 98, and you end the decade with no Michael Jordan. That's not great, okay? Could you imagine if LeBron James just retired after 2013 or 2014? If he just retired for 2 years, and then he came back, he won his title in Cleveland, and then when the Warriors formed, he just retired again? Like, that would suck. That would really hurt the decade, and I think it did in the 90s too. It's not good to have your best player leave. Now, Hakeem Olajuwon kind of picked up the slack the first time, but the second time, like 1999 was just a terrible year for basketball. You get the combination of Michael Jordan retiring, followed by the fact that it's a lockout season, and then the Spurs win the title despite not being the most interesting team. Now, I love Tim Duncan, and I'm going to go over that a lot in the 2000s decade talk, but he's not a super interesting player, okay? The Spurs were not a super interesting team to watch because they played great but smart, slow basketball. They didn't care about the entertainment factor, they cared about winning. So because of that, 1999 really drags this season down. You've had a lockout year and no Michael Jordan. And, I mean, it's just 1 year, but at the same time, decades are only 10 years long. So if you're taking a tenth of the decade and saying it wasn't great, like, that kind of hurts it. You know, and it also hurts to have, you know, even the middle of the decade, even with Hakeem Olajuwon picking up the slack, that's gotta suck to have Michael Jordan being gone, okay? It's just not good to have the best player in the league, the most popular player in the league, just disappearing. It's not good. It's not good for popularity, it's not good for money, it's not good for entertainment. So because of that, I cannot say that the 90s were the best decade in NBA history. However, they were the best so far, and they stack up pretty damn well with the decades to come. So thank you all for watching this. If you enjoyed this video, if you could please like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. And check out some of the other videos on my channel. If you haven't seen them already, please check out my video on the 80s and on the 60s, and my video on the 2000s will be coming soon. Thank you.